Good morning or afternoon if you're watching this at 3 o'clock, like our normally scheduled time. I'm Charlotte, and this is quarantine story time, where we were using the shelter in place due to COVID-19 to read some classic literature, and we chose one of the longest books, War and Peace. And after having been reading it for probably a little over about 3 months now, we're halfway. So yay! Sorry to everyone. I did try to get on Friday and had some technical difficulties, some weather difficulties. I was literally like huddled in the rain trying to read to you, and it just was not working. So these things happen. In the immortal words of the producers of the theater in Phantom of the Opera, these things happen. But we're back today, and we'll be reading sections 9, 10, and 11. And basically we're picking up back with Prince Andrei as he is rejoining the army, partially to look for Anatoly Kuragin so he can find a way to get him to challenge him for a duel because he's still mad at him, and also partially so he can just run away from the sameness of his life that reminds him of how sad he is that Natasha betrayed his affection for her, or for him. So without too much further ado, let's just jump right in. Prince Andrei arrived in the general headquarters of the army at the end of June. The troops of the First Army, whom the Emperor was with, were stationed in a fortified camp on the Drissa. The troops of the Second Army were in retreat, with the aim of joining the First Army, from which it was said they were cut off by large forces of the French. Everyone was displeased with the general course of military affairs in the Russian army, but of the danger of an invasion of the Russian provinces no one even thought. No one even supposed that the war would be carried further than the western Polish provinces. Prince Andrei found Barclay de Tolly, to whom he had been assigned, on the bank of the Drissa, and there was not a single large village or settlement in the vicinity of the camp. All the huge number of generals and courtiers who were with the army settled within a radius of 7 miles in the best houses of the hamlets on this and on the other side of the river. Barclay de Tolly was staying some 3 miles from the sovereign. He received Bolkonsky dryly and coldly, and said with his German accent that he would report his arrival to the sovereign so as to determine an assignment for him, and meanwhile he invited him to stay with his staff. Anatoly Kuragin, with whom Prince Andrei had hoped to find the army, was not there. He was in Petersburg, and that news pleased Bolkonsky. Prince Andrei was taken up by the interest of being at the center of a huge ongoing war. He was glad to be free for a time of the vexation produced in him by the thought of Kuragin. In the course of the first 4 days, during which he was not called for anywhere, Prince Andrei rode around the entire fortified camp, and, with the help of his knowledge and of conversation with well-informed people, tried to form some idea of it for himself. But the question of whether this camp was advantageous or not remained unresolved for Prince Andrei. He had already managed to draw from his military experience the conviction that in military matters, the most profoundly devised plans meant nothing, as he had seen in the Austerlitz campaign. That everything depended on how one responded to the unexpected and unpredictable actions of the enemy. That everything depended on how and by whom the action was conducted. To clarify this last question for himself, Prince Andrei, using his position and acquaintances, tried to penetrate the character of the army's administration, of the persons and parties participating in it, and arrived at the following idea about the state of affairs. While the sovereign was still in Vilno, the army was divided in 3. The First Army was under the command of Barclay de Tolly, the second under the command of Bagration, the third under the command of Tormasov. The sovereign was with the First Army, but not as a commander-in-chief. It was not stated in the orders that the sovereign would be in command, but only that the sovereign would be present in the army. Besides that, the sovereign personally did not have a commander-in-chief's staff with him, but the staff of the imperial headquarters. With him were the chief of the imperial staff, the quartermaster general, Prince Volkonsky, generals, imperial adjutants, diplomatic officials, and a large number of foreigners, but there were no army staff. Besides them, the following persons were with the sovereign without any specific function: Arakcheev, the former Minister of War; Count Benigsin, the highest ranking of the generals; the Grand Duke of Tsivarich, Konstantin Pavlovich, Count Rumyantsev, the Chancellor, Stein, a former Prussian minister, Armfeldt, a Swedish general, Pfuel, the chief author of the plan of campaign, the Adjutant General Paolucci, a native of Sardinia, Wolzogen, and many more. Though these people were with the army without any military function, they had influence through their position, and often a corps commander and even the commander-in-chief did not know in what capacity Bennigsen or the Grand Duke or Arikchiv or Prince Volkonsky asked or advised one thing or the other, and did not know whether it was from his own person or from the sovereign that this or that in the form of advice proceeded, and whether it was not it was necessary to carry it out. But these externals, while the essential meaning of the presence of the sovereign and all these persons, from the court point of view, and in the sovereign's presence, everyone became a courtier, was clear to everyone. It was but these externals, while the essential meaning, but these were externals. There we go. While the essential meaning of the presence of the sovereign and all these persons, from the court point of view, and in the sovereign's presence, everyone became a courtier, was clear to everyone. It was the following. The sovereign did not take upon himself the title of commander-in-chief, but he gave orders to all the armies. The people of his entourage were his assistants. Arikchiv was the faithful executor protector of the order and the sovereign's bodyguard. Bennigsen was a landowner of Vilno province who was as if doing les honneurs for the province, but in reality was a good general, useful for his advice, and for always being at hand to replace Barclay. The Grand Duke was there because such was his pleasure. The ex-minister Stein was there because he was useful for his advice and because the Emperor Alexander valued his personal qualities highly. Armfeldt was a vicious hater of Napoleon and a self-assured general, which always had an effect on Alexander. Paolucci was there because he was bold and resolute in his speech. The adjutant generals were there because they were there wherever the sovereign was. And finally, above all, Pfuel was there because, having drawn up the plan of war against Napoleon and having made Alexander believe in the advisability of this plan, he was directing the whole business of the war. Pfuel had come with Wolzogen, who had conveyed Pfuel's thoughts in a form more accessible than Pfuel did, a closet theoretician, abrupt and self-confident to the point of despising everything. Besides the persons listed, Russian and foreigners, especially the foreigners, who with the boldness characteristic of people acting in an alien milieu, suggested new, unexpected ideas every day. There were also many secondary persons who were with the army because their superiors were there. Among all the ideas and voices in this immense, restless, brilliant, and proud world, Prince Andrei saw the following more sharply distinguished tendencies and parties. The first party was Pfuel and his followers, military theorists who believed that there was a science of war, and that in this science there were immutable laws, the laws of oblique movement, of outflanking, and so on. Pfuel and his followers called for a retreat into the depths of the country, a retreat according to the precise laws set down by the imaginary theory of war, saw in every departure from this theory only barbarism, ignorance, or ill will. To this party belonged the German princes, Wolzogen, Wintzerodt, and others, predominantly German. The second party was the opposite of the first. As always happens, to one extreme corresponded representatives of the other extreme. The people of this party were those who, ever since Vilno, had been calling for an advance into Poland and freedom from all previously made plans. Along with representatives of bold action, the people of this party were at the same time representatives of nationalism, which made them still more one-sided in dispute. These were Russians, Bagration, Ermolov, who was at the beginning of his rise, and others. At that time, a well-known joke of Ermolov's was spread that he was supposedly asked the sovereign for just one favor, to promote him to German. The people of this party said, recalling Suvorov, that there was no need to think, no need to stick pins in the map, but to fight, to beat the enemy, not to let them into Russia, and not to let the troops lose heart. To the third party, which the sovereign trusted most of all, belonged the courtiers, who made little deals between those two tendencies. The people of this party, for the most part non-military, and to whom Arikchiv belonged, thought and said what people usually say who have no conviction but wish to seem as if they do. They said that the war, especially with such a genius as Bonaparte, he was again known as Bonaparte, undoubtedly called for the most profoundly pondered considerations, for a profound knowledge of science, and in this matter Pafil was a genius. But along with that, one could not help admitting that theorists were often one-sided, and therefore one must not fully trust them. One must lend an ear to what Pafil's opponents and practical people experienced in military affairs have to say, and choose a middle course. The people of this party insisted on holding on to the Drissa camp according to Pafil's plan, while changing the movements of the other armies. Though this course of action attained neither one goal nor the other, to the people of this party it seemed better that way. The fourth tendency was the tendency of which the most conspicuous representative was the Grand Duke, the heir to the throne, who was unable to forget his disappointment at Austerlitz, where, as at a review he had ridden out at the head of his guards in a casque and collet, counting on boldly crushing the French, and ending up in the front line, had barely managed to escape amidst the general confusion. The people of this party had, in their opinion, both the merit and the defect of sincerity. They were afraid of Napoleon, they saw strength in him and weakness in themselves, and said so outright. They said, "Nothing will come of it but shame, grief, and ruin. We abandon Vilna, we abandon Vitebsk, and we will abandon the Drissa. The one intelligent thing left for us to do is to conclude a peace as soon as possible before we're driven out of Petersburg." This view of things, widely spread in the higher spheres of the army, found support both in Petersburg and in the Chancellor Rumyantsev, who, for other reasons of state, was also for peace. The fifth were adherents of Barclay de Tolly, not so much as a man, but as a minister of war and commander-in-chief. They said, wherever else he may be, they always began that way, "He's an honest, practical man, and there's nobody better. Give him real power, because war cannot proceed successfully without unity of command, and he will show what he can do, as he has showed himself in Finland. If there is order and strength in our army, it has withdrawn to Drissa without suffering any losses. We own that only to Barclay. If Barclay is now replaced with Bennigsen, all will be lost, because Bennigsen already showed his incompetence in 1807, said the people of this party. The sixth, the Bennigsenists, said on the contrary that all the same there was no more practical and experience than Bennigsen, and that however you twisted and turned, all the same you would come to him. And the people of this party kept maintaining that our whole withdrawal to the Drissa was a most disgraceful defeat and an unbroken series of errors. The more errors they make, the better, they said. At least they'll understand sooner that it can't go on like this. And what's needed is not some sort of Barclay, but a man like Bennigsen, who has already showed himself in 1807, who was even given credit by Napoleon himself, a man whose authority would be willingly recognized, and the only such man is Bennigsen. The seventh were persons who always exist, especially around young sovereigns, and who were especially numerous around the Emperor Alexander, generals and imperial adjutants who were passionately devoted to the sovereign, not as an emperor, but as a man, adoring him sincerely and disinterestedly, as Rostov had adored him in 1805, and who saw in him not only all virtues but all human qualities. These persons, while admiring the modesty of the sovereign in refusing to take command of the army, also disapproved of this excessive modesty and wished for and insisted upon only one thing, that the adored sovereign, abandoning his excessive distrust of himself, would openly announce that he was placing himself at the head of the army and would assemble around him the headquarters of a commander-in-chief, asking advice whenever necessary from experienced theoreticians and practitioners, and would himself lead his troops, whom this alone would bring to the state of highest inspiration. The eighth and the largest group of people, which was so enormous that it outnumbered the others 99-1, consisted of people who desired neither peace nor war, neither an offensive movement nor a defensive camp in Drissa, or wherever it might be, neither Barclay nor the sovereign, neither Paful nor Bennigsen, but who desired only one thing, and that the most essential, the greatest benefit and pleasure for themselves. In those muddy waters of crisscrossing and entangling intrigues that swirled around the sovereign's headquarters, one could succeed in a great deal that would have been unthinkable at any other time. One, wishing only to hold on to his advantageous position, agreed with Paful today, with his adversary tomorrow, and 2 days later maintained that he had no opinion on the subject, only so as to avoid responsibility and please the sovereign. Another, in his wish to gain some advantage, drew the sovereign's attention to himself, loudly repeating what the sovereign had alluded to the day before, arguing and shouting at the council, beating his breast and challenging those who disagreed to a duel, thus demonstrating that he was prepared to be a victim for the common good. A third, between two councils, and in the absence of his enemies, simply solicited a reward for his faithful service, knowing that there was no time to bother with a refusal. A fourth kept trying to catch the sovereign's eye as if by chance, as one burdened by his labors. A fifth, in order to achieve a long-desired goal, a dinner with the sovereign, fiercely insisted on the rightness or wrongness of a newly emerged opinion, and to that end put forth more or less forceful and correct arguments. All the people in this party were pursuing rubles, crosses, ranks, and in this pursuit were merely followed where the weather vane of the Tsar's favor pointed. And as soon as they noticed the weather vane turning in a certain direction, all this drone population of the army began to blow in the same direction, so that it was harder for the sovereign to change it for another. Amidst the uncertainty of the situation, with the threat of serious danger, which gave everything an especially disquieting character, amidst this whirlwind of intrigues, vanities, clashes of various views and feelings, all these people of different tribes, this eighth and largest party of people concerned only with personal interests, brought great confusion and perplexity to the common cause. Whatever question arose, the swarm of drones, not yet done humming over the previous topic, flew on to the new one, and their buzzing drowned out and obscured the sincerely disputing voices. From all these parties, one more, the ninth, emerged and began to raise its voice just as Prince Andrei came to the army. This was the party of older people, intelligent, experienced in statesmanship, and who were able, without sharing any of these contradictory opinions, to look at everything that went on at headquarters abstractly, and to reflect on the means of getting out of this uncertainty, irresolution, confusion, and weakness. The people of this party said and thought that all the harm came primarily from the presence of the sovereign and his military court in the army, that it brought into the army that indefinite, conditional, and fluctuating instability of relations which are suitable to the court but bad for the army, that the sovereign ought to rule and not command troops, that the only way out of this situation was the departure of the sovereign and his court from the army, that the mere presence of the sovereign paralyzed the 50,000 troops needed to ensure his personal safety, that the very worst but independent commander-in-chief would be better than the very best but bound by the presence and authority of the sovereign. At the same time, when Prince Andrei was living unoccupied on the Drissa, Shishkov, the Secretary of State, who was one of the chief representatives of this party, wrote a letter to the sovereign which Balashov and Arikchiv agreed to sign. In this letter, taking advantage of the permission granted him by the sovereign to discuss the general course of affairs, he respectfully suggested that the sovereign leave the army under the pretext that it was necessary for him to inspire the people of the capital for war. The sovereign's inspiring of the people and calling them to the defense of the fatherland, that very inspiring of the people insofar as it was produced by the sovereign's presence in Moscow, which was the chief cause of Russia's triumph, was presented to and accepted by the sovereign as a pretext for leaving the army. Section 10. The letter had not yet been given to the sovereign when Barclay told Bolkonsky at dinner that the sovereign would like to see Prince Andrei in person in order to question him about Turkey, and that Prince Andrei was to go to Benigsen's quarters at 6 o'clock in the evening. On the same day, information was received in the sovereign's quarters about new movements of Napoleon that might prove dangerous to the army, information which subsequently proved incorrect. At that same morning, Colonel Michaud, making the rounds of the Drissa fortifications with the sovereign, tried to persuade the sovereign that this fortified camp, set up by Paful, which till then had been considered a tactical chef d'oeuvre, that would be the destruction of Napoleon, that this camp was absurd and would be the destruction of the Russian army. Prince Andrei arrived at the quarters of General Benigsen, who occupied a small manor house right on the banks of the river. Neither Benigsen nor the sovereign were there, but Chernyshov, the imperial adjutant, received Bolkonsky and announced to him that the sovereign had ridden with General Benigsen and Marquis Palucci to make a second round of the fortifications of the Drissa camp. the suitability of which had become a subject of strong doubts. Chernyshov was sitting with a French novel by a window in the first room. This room was probably once the reception room. An organ still stood there, with some sort of rugs piled on it, and in one corner stood the camp bed of Benigson's adjutant. This adjutant was there. He sat on the rolled-up bedding and dozed, evidently worn out by carousing or work. There were two doors in the reception room. One led straight to the former drawing room, the other to the study on the right. From the first door came the sounds of voices talking in German and occasionally in French. There, in the former drawing room, were assembled, at the sovereign's wish, not a council of war. The sovereign liked indefiniteness, but some persons whose opinions about the forthcoming difficulties he wished to know. It was not a council of war, but, as it were, a council of some people chosen to clarify certain questions personally for the sovereign. This semi-council there had been invited to the semi-council had been invited the Swedish General Armfeldt, the Adjutant General Wolzogen, Winserode, with whom Napoleon had called a fugitive French subject, Michaud told Count Stein, who was not a military man at all, and finally Paful himself, who, as Prince Andrei had heard, was the cheville ouvrier of the whole thing. Prince Andrei chanced to have a good look at him, because Paful arrived soon after heated and went to the drawing room after stopping for a moment to talk with Chernyshov. At first glance, Paful, in his poorly cut Russian general's uniform, which sat awkwardly on him like a mummer's costume, seemed familiar to Prince Andrei, though he had never seen him. There was in him something of Weyrother and of Mack and of Schmidt and of other German theorist generals whom Prince Andrei had managed to see in 1805, but he was the most typical of them all. Such a German theorist who combined in himself all that there was in those other Germans, Prince Andrei had never seen before. Paful was of small stature, very thin, but broad-boned, of coarse, robust build, with broad hips and sharp shoulder blades. His face was very wrinkled, his eyes deep-set. His hair in front, at the temples, had obviously been hastily slicked down with a brush, but in back it stuck up naively in little tufts. He came into the room, looking around uneasily and angrily, as if he was afraid of everything in that big room he had come into. Keeping a hand awkwardly on his sword, he addressed Chernyshov, asking in German where the sovereign was. He clearly wanted to go inside as quickly as possible, have done with the bowings and greetings, and get down to work on the map, where he felt he belonged. He hastily nodded his head to Chernyshov's words and smiled ironically, listening to him say that the sovereign was inspecting the fortifications which he, Paful himself, had laid out according to his theory. He grumbled something to himself in a tough bass voice, the way self-assured Germans speak, Dummkopf, or zugrund des gens geschieht's, or sie wird was geschieht's die raus werden. Prince Andrei did not quite hear and would have passed by, but Chernyshov introduced him to Paful, observing that Prince Andrei had come from Turkey, where the war had ended so fortunately. Paful barely glanced, not so much as though Prince Andrei, and said, laughing, "Da muss ein schöner taktischer Krieg gewesen sein." And with a contemptuous laugh, he walked into the room in which the voices were heard. Clearly, Paful, always ready for ironic irritation anyways, was especially upset that day that they had dared to inspect and criticize his camp without him. From this brief encounter with Paful, Prince Andrei, owing to his memories of Austerlitz, formed a clear notion of the man's character for himself. Paful was one of those hopelessly, permanently, painfully self-assured men, as only Germans can be, and precisely because only Germans can be self-assured on the basis of an abstract idea, science, that is, an imaginary knowledge of the perfect truth. A Frenchman is self-assured because he considers himself personally, in mind as well as body, irresistibly enchanting for men as well as women. An Englishman is self-assured on the grounds that he is a citizen of the best organized state in the world, and therefore, as an Englishman, he always knows what he must do and knows that everything he does as an Englishman is unquestionably good. An Italian is self-assured because he is excitable and easily forgets himself and others. A Russian is self-assured precisely because he does not know anything and does not want to know anything, because he does not believe it possible to know anything fully. A German is self-assured worst of all, and most firmly of all, and most disgustingly of all, because he imagines that he knows the true science which he has invented himself, but which for him is the absolute truth. Such, obviously, was Paful. He had science, the theory of oblique movement, which he deduced from the theory of wars of Frederick the Great, and everything he came across in contemporary military history seemed to him senseless barbarism, grotesque clashes, in which so many mistakes were made on both sides that the wars could not be called wars. They did not fit the theory and could not serve as material for science. In 1806, Paful had been one of the architects of the plan of war that had ended with Jena and Auerstadt, but he did not see the outcome of that war the least proof of the incorrectness of his theory. On the contrary, to his mind, the departures from his theory were the only cause of the whole failure, and he, with a gleeful irony all his own, used to say, Ich sagte ja, dass die ganze Geschwitz zum Teufel gehen wird. I said that the whole thing would go to the devil. Paful was one of those theorists who so love their theory that they forget the purpose of the theory, its application in practice. In his love for the theory, he hated everything practical and did not want to know about it. He was even glad of failure, because failure, proceeding from departures from theory in practice, only proved to him the correctness of his theory. He exchanged a few words with Prince Andrei and Chernyshov about the present war, with the expression of a man who knows beforehand that it will all go badly and who is not displeased by that. The unbrushed tufts of his hair on his nape and his hastily slicked down side whiskers were the most eloquent confirmation of it. He went into the other room, and at once from there came the grumbling sounds of his bass voice. Well, there certainly are plenty of people in the world like that who would rather see it burn as if they could prove themselves right. I love the descriptions of the different nationalities' self-assuredness. Section 11. Prince Andrei was still following Paful with his eyes when Count Bennigsen hurriedly came into the room and nodded to Bolkonsky without pausing, went to the study, giving some orders to his adjutant. The sovereign was coming behind him, and Bennigsen had hurried ahead so as to prepare things and have time to meet the sovereign. Chernyshov and Prince Andrei went out to the porch. The sovereign, with a weary look, was getting off his horse. Marquis Paolucci was telling him something. The sovereign, his head inclined to the left, listened with a displeased air to Paolucci, who was speaking with particular vehemence. The sovereign started on, apparently wishing to finish the conversation, but the flushed, excited Italian, forgetting propriety, walked after him, still speaking. Quante estule che cancelle de second, le camte drissa, Paolucci was saying at the moment when the sovereign, going up the steps and noticing Prince Andrei, began peering at the unfamiliar pace. Quante celu, sire, Paolucci went on desperately, as if unable to restrain himself. Que conseille le camte drissa, je ne vois pas d'autre alternative que le mensonge, ou le gibet. Not hearing out and as if not listening to the Italian's words, the sovereign, having recognized Bolkonsky, graciously addressed him. Very glad to see you. Go in where they are assembled and wait for me. The sovereign went to the study. He was followed by Prince Pyotr Mikhailovich Volkonsky and Baron Stein, and the doors closed behind them. Prince Andrei, taking advantage of the sovereign's permission, went, along with Paolucci, whom he had known in Turkey, into the drawing room where the council was assembled. Prince Pyotr Mikhailovich Volkonsky occupied a post as something like the sovereign's chief of staff. Volkonsky came out of the study and, bringing maps to the drawing room and spreading them on the table, told the assembled gentlemen the question on which he would like to hear their opinion. The thing was that during the night, information had been received, subsequently proved false, that the French were moving to outflank the Drissa camp. The first to begin speaking was General Armfeldt, who, to get around the difficulty presented, unexpectedly suggested a new position, totally inexplicable, except by his wish to show that he too could have an opinion, away from the Petersburg and Moscow roads, at which, in his opinion, the united army should await the enemy. It was clear that this plan had been put together by Armfeldt long ago, He was now expounding it not so much with the purpose of answering the question posed, which this plan did not answer, as with the purpose of using the opportunity to speak about it. It was one of the millions of suggestions that could be made, as well founded as any other, if one had no notion of what character the war would take. Some argued against his opinion, some defended it. The young Colonel Toll argued against the Swedish general's opinion more vehemently than the others, and during the argument took from his side pocket a notebook full of writing, which he had permission to read. In an extensively composed project, Toll suggested another plan of campaign, the complete opposite of Armfeldt's plan and Paful's plan. Paolucci, objecting to Toll, suggested a plan of advance and attack, which alone, he said, could take us out of the uncertainty and the trap, as he called the Drissa camp, in which we found ourselves. During this argument, Paful and his translator Wolzogen, his bridge in court relations, were silent. Paful merely snorted scornfully and looked away, showing that he would never lower himself to objecting to the nonsense he was listening to. But when Prince Volkonsky, who was leading the debate, called on him to express his opinion, he merely said, "Why ask me? General Armfeldt has suggested a beautiful position, with an exposed rear, or the attack von diesem italischen Herrn sehr schön, or a retreat. Au gut. Why ask me?" he said. "You yourselves know everything better than I." But when Volkonsky, frowning, said that he was asking his opinion on behalf of the sovereign, Paful stood up and suddenly animated began to speak. "You have ruined everything, confused everything, wanted to know everything better than I. And now you come to me, how can we fix it? There's nothing to fix. Everything should have been carried out precisely according to the foundations I laid down," he said, rapping his bony knuckles on the table. "What is the difficulty? Nonsense! Kinderspiel!" He went up to the map and started speaking quickly, jabbing his dry finger at the map and insisting that no chance could alter the expediency of the Drissa camp, that everything had been foreseen, that if the enemy should indeed outflank it, they would inevitably be destroyed. Paolucci, who did not know German, started asking questions in French. Wolzogen came into the aid of his principal, who spoke French poorly, and started translating his words, barely keeping up with Paful, who rapidly proved that not only everything that had happened, but everything that could happen had been foreseen in his plan, and that if there were difficulties now, the whole blame lay in the fact that everything had not been carried out precisely. He kept laughing ironically, demonstrated it, and at last contemptuously stopped demonstrating, as a mathematician stopped checking in various ways the once proven correctness of the problem. Wolzogen replaced him, continuing to set forth his thoughts in French and saying to Paful every now and then, "Nicht wahr, Excellence?" Paful, like a man who in the heart of battle strikes his own side, shouted angrily at Wolzogen as well. "Nun ja, was soll denn danach explicit worden?" Paolucci and Michaud with two voices fell upon Wolzogen in French. Armfeldt addressed Paful in German. Toll explained something to Volkonsky in Russian. Prince Andrei silently listened and observed. Of all these persons, the one who most awakened Prince Andrei's sympathy was the embittered, resolute, and senselessly self-assured Paful. He alone, of all the persons present, there obviously desired nothing for himself, felt no enmity with anyone, and desired only one thing, the putting into action of a plan worked out according to a theory arrived at 3 years of labor. He was ridiculous, he was unpleasant in his irony, but at the same time he inspired an involuntary respect by his boundless devotion to his idea. Besides that, in all the speeches of all the speakers, with the exception of Paful, there was one common feature which had not been there at the Council of War in 1805. There was now, however concealed, a panic fear before the genius of Napoleon, a fear that voiced itself in every objection. Every possible supposition was made with regard to Napoleon. He was expected on all sides, and with his terrible name they demolished each other's suggestions. Paful alone, it seemed, considered him, Napoleon, as much as a barbarian as all opponents of his theory. But besides a feeling of respect, Paful inspired a feeling of pity in Prince Andrei. From the tone in which the courtiers addressed him, from what Paolucci had allowed himself to say to the emperor, but above all, from a certain desperation in Paful's own expressions, it was clear that the others knew and he himself sensed that his fall was near. And despite his self-assurance and grumbling German irony. He was pitiful, with his hair slicked down on his temples and tufts sticking out at his nape. Though he clearly concealed it behind an appearance of irritation and contempt, he was clearly in despair, because the sole remaining opportunity of making an enormous experiment and proving the correctness of his theory to the whole world was slipping away from him. The debates went on for a long time, and the longer it went on, the more heated the arguments became, reaching the point of shouting and personal remarks, and the less possible it was to draw any general conclusion from all that had been said. Listening to this multilingual talk and these suggestions, plans, and refutations and shouts, Prince Andrei was simply amazed at what they all said. The thoughts he had often used to have long ago, during the time of his military activity, that there was not and could not be any military science, and therefore there could not be any so-called military genius, now acquired for him the perfect evidence of truth. What theory and what science could be in a matter of which the conditions and circumstances are unknown and cannot be determined, in which the solutions of those active in war can still less be determined? No one could or can know what position our own and the enemy army will be in a day later, and no one can know the strength of this or that detachment. Sometimes, when there is no coward at the head who shouts, "We're cut off," and runs away, but a cheerful, bold man who shouts, "Hurrah!" a detachment of 5,000 is worth 30,000, as at Schöngraben, and sometimes 50,000 flee in the face of 8, as at Austerlitz. What science can there be in a matter in which, as in any practical matter, nothing can be determined and everything depends on countless circumstances, the significance of which is determined at a certain moment, and no one knows when that moment will come? Armfeldt says our army is cut off, and Paolucci says we've put the French army between two fires. Michaud says the Drissa camp is no good because the river is behind it, and Paful says its strength lies in that. Toll suggests one plan, Armfeldt another. They're all good, they're all bad, and the advantages of any position can become evident only at the moment when the event occurs. Why do they all talk about military genius? Is that man a genius who manages to order a timely delivery of biscuits and tells this one to go right and that one to go left? It is only because the military men are clothed in splendor and power, and masses of scoundrels flatter power, endowing it with qualities of genius it does not have, that they are called geniuses. On the contrary, the best generals I knew were stupid or absent-minded people. Bagration was the best. Napoleon himself recognized that, and Bonaparte himself. I remember his self-satisfied and limited face on the battlefield at Austerlitz. A good commander not only does not need genius or any special qualities, but on the contrary, he needs the absence of the best and highest human qualities: love, poetry, tenderness, a searching philosophical doubt. He should be limited, firmly convinced that what he is doing is very important. Otherwise, he would not have the patience enough, and only then will he be a brave commander. God forbid he should be a human being and come to love or pity someone, or start thinking about what is just and what isn't. Understandably, the theory of genius was cut to fit them of old because they are power. The merit of success in military affairs does not depend on them, but on the men in the ranks who shout, "We're lost," or shouts, "Hurrah!" And it is only in the ranks that one can serve with assurance of being useful. So thought Prince Andrei as he listened to the debate, and he came to his senses only when Paolucci called him and everyone was leaving. At the review the next day, the sovereign asked Prince Andrei where he would like to serve, and Prince Andrei was forever lost to the world of the court when he did not ask to remain with the person of the sovereign, but asked permission to serve in the army. And that is the end of section 11. That's rather interesting because Prince Andrei is sort of, for a while, has been more interested in the army, or, well, not even just the army, but more interested in things away from the courtly life. And also, it's interesting because so many of the men and male characters in this book have been drawn into the army. So maybe that's the whole war part of War and Peace, is not so much the actual war, but the half of the characters wanting to be part of the machine of war. But anyways, very interesting. A little bit tricky reading today, especially with the German thrown in. my apologies to any Germans who are listening and despised my horrible pronunciation. Stay safe out there, folks. Have a great day. Keep doing good. And we'll see you guys tomorrow.